This presentation is, I call Autism, the Symbolism of the Mouth, and a New Approach to Totem and Taboo. This is actually a very short version of something I presented here a number of years ago, which was kind of large and rather ungainly. I'm hoping that this shorter, more concise presentation will also be more intelligible so that I can try to get out a kind of a complex idea, but in a way that will be easier to grasp. Speculation on the relationship between psychological development and cultural evolution existed long before psychoanalysis, but subsequently played an important role in Sigmund Freud's theorizing about the nature of the symbolic function and the origins of the Oedipus complex. It is an aspect of psychoanalysis that was never rejected, but was neglected over the years as clinical concerns took the attention of analysts' interests and as the assumptions underlying Freud's psycho-Lamarckian speculations collapsed under the discoveries of modern science. Nonetheless, if asked about the origins of the Oedipus complex, the recurring symbolism in dreams, or the relationship between dreams and myth, most psychoanalytic clinicians would probably offer up, or at least mention, Freud's outdated speculations. These include the individual's biological inheritance of a cultural memory of repeated events in our prehistoric past, such as a matriarchy preceding a patriarchy, a primal father who kept all the females to himself, the castration of young men who threatened the primal father, the killing of the primal father by the fraternal clan, and the totemic feast in celebration of and in atonement for the murder of the primal father, which brought about the establishment of culture. These ideas are found throughout Freud's writings, but were featured prominently in Totem and Taboo, 1913. Freud built his reconstructions of prehistory on the 19th century assumptions that were outdated even at the time he wrote them. But he wrote them with conviction and maintained them for the rest of his life. These faulty assumptions were: 1, the notion that the deeds of our ancestors are inherited and remembered by all of us in the uniformity of our psychodynamics and universal symbolism, and 2, the notion that individual development is driven by the cultural evolution of our species. But memories are not inherited, and the similarities between cultural evolution and individual development are not causal. Despite the fact that Freud's basic assumptions were wrong, as were his conclusions, I consider Totem and Taboo to be the jewel of Freud's genius. For in this remarkable little book, he found points of agreement, what he called points of agreement, or what I call analogous relations between psychological development, psychopathology, stages in cultural evolution, myths, and rituals. More specifically, he analogized the phallic stage with the psychopathologies of the obsessive and sometimes the hysteric, the totemism of prehistory, the myth of Oedipus, and the ritual of the totemic feast. The analogies were organized around the incestuous desire for the mother, the horror of incest, the murderous impulses toward the father, and the remorse and mourning for the murdered father. Look at that. This is just an act of utter genius to look at cultural evolution, the development of the child, psychopathology, myths, and rituals, and to go, wait a minute, there is something lining up here. It's just absolutely brilliant. What you see there up in the corner is the obverse of the medallion that was given to Freud when he turned 50. In 1906, he turned 50, and his colleagues got together and they made these medallions, one with a picture of Freud on one side and the other with this image of Oedipus talking to the Sphinx. And you remember the Sphinx's riddle was, what walks on 4 legs in the morning and 2 during the day and 3 in the evening? The man who crawls in infancy walks on 2 legs, and then, as we see here, has the cane in older age. Well, as good fate would have it, there weren't many of these that were made, but here's one of them. And so you might enjoy passing it around. In Totem and Taboo, Freud speculated on the origins of our psychodynamics in relation to what happened in our prehistoric past. He concluded that the deeds of our ancestors, incest, the primal father's castration of young men, the young men killing and cannibalizing the father, the young men feeling remorse for their deeds and mourning the father, all became species-specific memories that were inherited by the species, and that in this recollection we recall these in the uniformity of our complexes and psychoanalytic symbolism. I have a different formulation comprised of 2 components. First, I assert that our psychodynamics emerged 50,000 years ago, when our symbolic function evolved its present capacities, and simply clothed our primate social instincts in language. These primate social instincts are embedded in what Sir Julian Huxley called ritualizations. These are the innate fixed action patterns of animal behavior that support the development of the individual and the survival of the species. These are complex, innate social behaviors like greeting ritualizations. Okay? There's nothing casual about greeting ritualizations. If you read any of Jane Goodall's work, there's always in the index a large section on discussing greeting ritualizations. This is a genetically determined, innate social behavior that supports the life of the individual and the group. Greeting ritualizations, dominance and submission ritualizations, territorial defense, courtship, copulation, and so on. These are all, it's not as though chimpanzees or any other animals out there just sort of doing wild, crazy things. Their life is very well organized around these innate fixed action patterns that are supporting the development of the individual and the maintenance of the social group. From my point of view, the psychodynamics appear when ritualizations are clothed in language. We begin to hang words on our primate ritualizations. The second component of my formulation states that throughout the course of prehistory, the challenges of culture drew solutions from the vicissitudes of libido development in such a way that the Paleolithic appears in some ways analogous to the oral stage, the Neolithic analogous to the anal stage, the High Neolithic analogous to the phallic stage, and the Urban Revolution analogous to the adolescent genital stage. Curiously enough, the key for me came from the Jungian formulation of the brief psychotic disorder, as described by John Weir Perry, who discovered that there were 10 images and themes that commonly recur in the hallucinations and delusions of psychotic patients. Now, he was a quite distinguished Jungian who wrote extensively. I read his work, I knew him, but I find it very easy to make a Freudian reinterpretation, especially as concerns things like the Freudian concepts of the symbolic function and the Jungian concepts of the archetypes, for example. These 10 recurring images that Perry found in listening to his psychotic patients, and by the way, he was listening to these psychotic patients typically in hospitals. This is before Thorazine and all the other psychotropics. So these were a lot of people who were unmedicated psychotics. Or if they were medicated, they were not medicated on some of the more modern medications. The images that kept recurring again and again in the hallucinations and delusions of his psychotic patients, you won't be surprised to hear, they're images of being at the center of the universe, feeling that they're dying, there's a death going on, or they're in the afterlife, they're in hell, or something like this. A feeling of return to beginnings. They're in the Garden of Eden now. A cosmic conflict, a fight between the opposites, whether it's heaven and hell, or the communists and the democratic countries, or the male and the female, these sorts of cosmic conflicts. A threat of the opposite sex. Of course, we remember Schreber. No, not Schreber. But Schreber also. With the fear of the opposite sex. Apotheosis. I'm God, I'm Napoleon, I'm Jesus Christ. Sacred marriage, an image of coming together of the opposites, new birth, and a new society. And a vision of a quadrated world. So he kept seeing in one case after another, and he demonstrates, he had like about 12 cases, and they all shared, probably at least 8 of these recurring images and themes. Interestingly enough, these images and themes also recur in the myths of sacral kingship, in the rituals of the ancient New Year festival, which typically emerge as cultures are passing from prehistoric high Neolithic cultures to urban revolution. That's the transition from non-literate cultures into literate cultures. It's when civilizations begin. Civilizations as defined by the calendar, the written word, large-scale war, these and sacral kingship. That the king is a representative of God on earth. That happened in cultures all around the world at different times. It happened at a different time in China than it did in Sumeria, than it did in, with the Aztecs. But you can see these curiously recurring themes. So these are the myths of sacral kingship and the rituals of the ancient New Year's festival, which are typically emerging in these cultures that are passing from the prehistoric high Neolithic cultures to the urban revolution cultures. That is, those cultures on the cusp of becoming civilizations, complete with kingship, occupational specialization, the written word, the calendar, and large standing armies. Perry's formulation made more explicit what was implicit in Freud's formulation. That is, the analogous relation between psychopathology, psychological development, a stage in cultural evolution, a myth, and a ritual. While Freud speculated beyond the amnesia of prehistory, Perry was able to theorize about history by anchoring his formulation in the very earliest written texts of various civilizations from around the world. And I would schematize the findings of Freud and Perry as follows. Oh, no, there's that. Here we are. So we see, for Freud, he's going to look, he's putting together the obsessional neurosis and sometimes he talked about the obsessional neurosis, sometimes he talked about hysteria. He didn't make his schema as tight as I'm presenting it here, but he said these things. Associated all with the phallic stage, with totemism, the myth of the hero, the sacrificial totemic feast, and the fraternal clan. Whereas Perry is going to talk about the brief psychotic disorder. It becomes associated with adolescence, the myth of sacred kingship, the ancient New Year's festival, and the urban revolution. Now, the 5 points of agreement in Freud's schema are organized, as I mentioned before, around the desire and horror of incest and the murderous impulses toward the father and the subsequent remorse for killing him. The 5 points of agreements in Perry's schema are organized around these 10 recurring images and themes mentioned earlier. Now, as it just so happens, I read John Weir Perry's work in 1974 when I was a child care worker in a psychoanalytic residential treatment center for 14 autistic children. It was there that I met Jimmy, a 9-year-old autistic boy with a slender build, big dreamy eyes, and thick wavy hair. He was quiet, passive, submissive, withdrawn, and spoke in a strange manner when he spoke at all. Jimmy was a slow eater, ate small portions of food, drank large quantities of milk, and was enuretic. His lips were often passively parted, with his lower jaw hanging slightly. I observed him performing a wide variety of repetitive, idiosyncratic behaviors such as finger snapping, spitting, rocking, knuckle biting, and hand flapping. My job was to awaken him each morning, change his sheets, which would inevitably be wet, get him showered and dressed for the in-house school program. But on my own initiative, I also gave him a piece of paper and 8 crayons: red, yellow, blue, orange, green, and brown, orange, green, purple, brown, and black. And I invited him to draw whatever he would like. As he drew, I took verbatim notes on his occasional comments, which were typically odd and idiosyncratic. He drew 1 picture a day, 5 days a week, for 2.5 years, for 2 years, and 5 drawings per session once a week for 3 years. During that time, Jimmy made 1,250 drawings, and you get an idea of these drawings here. Most of the drawings were circles or variations on circles, quadrated discs, suns, spirals, discs, or circles with a line off to the side. Jimmy described these circles as mouths. While drawing, he made references to chewing, biting, spitting. The mouth was most frequently identified with the cat, but on other occasions with the lion, the alligator, the rat, the dragon. As he would say, the mouth bites. The mouth has a star in it. And most frequently, closing the mouth. He would just be sitting there and he'd speak in a falsetto. He'd be drawing, closing the mouth. And you say, closing the mouth, and I try to invite him to elaborate it in sort of a kind of a incomplete sentence. Or the mouth has a star in it. And I'd say the mouth has a star in it, and sometimes he would elaborate, and sometimes not at all. But he was very, very difficult to reach him. Now, Margaret Mahler associated a normal autistic phase of ego development with early infancy, and Bruno Bettelheim hypothesized that damage around oral experience and totally repressed but extreme oral aggression are among the origins of this disturbance. I'm emphasizing the orality here. Francis Tustin suggested the crucial factor in the precipitation of psychogenic autism is the enraging and terrifying realization that, quote, the nipple of the breast was not part of the mouth, but was separate from it and could be gone, unquote. I have serious doubts about the psychosocial etiology of autism, But I have no doubt that autistic children do have a psychology, and this is what has interested me. I need to make a note here. When I began my work with these children, I was young, and we subscribed to this notion that all of these children were autistic by virtue of their horrific infancies. And indeed, one was raised by hippies and they fed him LSD. Another one was profoundly constipated for 9 months. Another one's mother was psychotic, depressed. Another one, the primary caretaker was his father, and then he was sent off to Vietnam, and his rather plastic, kind of hard-edged, psychotic mother was then in charge of him. Every one of them had a horror story to tell, or not that they told, but we knew about it. But you know what? A lot of people grow up in horrific circumstances. Children grow up in war zones and don't become autistic. So I think there's probably something to a psychogenic autism. I think when someone has been, profoundly neglected in the early stages, I suspect you'd probably get some of this, and probably many of these children were not helped, let's put it that way, by the horrific circumstances that they were raised in. But the fact of the matter is not all autistic children have horrific infancies, and those that have horrific infancies, not all of them become autistic. Now, of course, Jimmy was largely incapable of telling me about his drawings and what they might have meant to him. So to get a clue into what might be happening, I explored the symbolism of the mouth in myth and ritual and discovered 5 recurring meanings. The mouth is 1, the hero's passageway to death. It's the birth canal of the reborn hero. It's the avenue through which the soul embodies, the avenue of the soul's disembodiment, and an image of integral consciousness. The first 2 meanings pertain to the hero of myth, which Freud analogized with the ego. Freud and Ronk. The hero's entry into the mythical mouth symbolizes death, dismemberment, or the extinction of ego consciousness, the end of a way of being, or the end of a previously established worldview. The mouth as a symbol of death, destruction, and dismemberment is the gateway to the underworld, the jaws of hell, the devouring terrible mother, and time itself, the devourer of all things created. The swallowing or engulfing of the hero by the dark chaos dragon of unconsciousness is a mythic or fantasy analog to the experiences of drifting off to sleep, the weakening of the ego, and psychotic decompensation, wherein the worldview is fractured, melted, dismembered, or obliterated. The hero's death in myth or fantasy is a product of the imagination, and as such may also imply a return to the mouth womb of the Great Mother, with the potential of spiritual rebirth, the birth of consciousness, or the birth of a new worldview. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the great monster Humbaba, guardian of the wilderness, was said to have breath like fire, and his jaws were equated with death itself. In Greek mythology, Kronos, the god of time, ate his children, and Quetzalcoatl was the Aztec great-plumed serpent that could devour people in his jaws. The mouth as a birth canal for the hero is symbolic of an upper birth. The mouth is the place from which the hero is delivered anew, the center out of which he is resurrected, or the site of his rebirth. The image of the hero being reborn from the mouth is analogous to the experiences of awakening, psychological birth, the reconstitution of the ego following a psychotic episode, or any similar emergence of the ego from unconsciousness. Many cultures have mythological beings that personify the devouring aspect of the deity. Kali, Taurt, Gorgon, the witch, Rangda. But these figures also possess life-giving, nourishing, protective, and nurturing qualities, or at least counterpoise to a positive deity who possesses these qualities. An example is found in the myths of the Manja and Banda of Africa. A hairy black being, Ungakola, was said to live in the bush and was known to eat people and vomit them up renewed. He was configured into initiation rites, in which children died in the mouth of Ungakola and were vomited up, renewed, and initiated into the adult group. The motif of the swallowing and disgorging deity is common to myths and rituals in the Polynesian islands, Australian Aborigines, some native North American tribes, and various Aboriginal peoples in Africa, South America, just to name a few. The most familiar version of this motif in Western culture is the myth of Jonah and the great fish in the Old Testament. In Polynesia, a Polynesian myth tells of a hero named Nganeoa, who was swallowed along with his boat by a kind of whale. Nganeoa propped open the monster's mouth with the mast of his boat and then descended into its stomach, where he found both of his parents still alive. I love that idea. You go into the mouth of the dragon and discover your parents are in there. He lit a fire, killed the monster, and reemerged out of its mouth. The third and fourth meanings of the mouth pertains to the mouth as a passageway for the soul. In myth and tradition, as the soul enters the mouth or is swallowed, it leaves the celestial realms and enters into the limited world of human existence. While the hero entering the mouth represents a return to the mouth womb, the soul entering the mouth represents embodiment. You see, when the hero comes out of the mouth, it's like victory, reborn. When the soul comes out of the mouth, comes out in death and in madness. When the soul goes into the mouth, you become incarnated. You enter the world. You enter the body, you enter the world. When the hero goes in the mouth, is for dismemberment. So they have this complementary kind of relation to each other. While the hero entering the mouth represents a return to the mouth womb, the soul entering the mouth represents embodiment. Naturally enough, when the soul leaves the body by way of the mouth, it's a kind of mouth birth, or at least a liberation of sorts, and is associated with the astral flights, travels, and wanderings of the soul in dreams, visions, and imagined afterlife journeys. As such, the soul's departure from the mouth represents a disembodiment. In many traditions, illness is attributed to the soul leaving the body by way of the mouth and getting lost. Briffaut noted that a common fear among women in Germany was that a snake could slip into the woman's mouth while sleeping and cause her to become pregnant. Other tales tell of women being impregnated by swallowing a rose petal or a bug. In an ancient Egyptian creation myth, Khepera had union with his clenched hand, poured his seed into his mouth, and spat forth his son Shu and his daughter Tefnut. In Egyptian mythology, the eye of Horus is the hero's great treasure. It is defined as the sun in the mouth. You see how you can't look at the eye of Horus the same way ever again. It's actually a mouth with a sun in the middle of it. And it's symbolic of the creative word. When the Asian shaman is conducting a healing, he may breathe in deeply in order to take in the souls of his ancestors to help him in his work. When the shaman, journeying in the celestial realms, finds the lost soul of his suffering patient, he inhales and flies it back home. In some tales, placing the leaf of an herb on the lips of a dead man reunited his body and his soul, bringing him back to life. In an 11th or 12th century German painting, we see a woman lying on her deathbed while her naked soul slips out of her mouth. In the Indian tradition, there is a belief that yawning runs the risk of losing one's soul, and thumb snapping was a precaution taken to prevent this from happening. Of course, in all sorts of magical healings, if you take some saliva or hair from somebody, you then have some sort of magic powers. And I like to imagine that perhaps this Indian tradition of the fear of losing one's soul while yawning is sometimes, when a person yawns, sometimes a little saliva can shoot forth. And I'm imagining they constructed around this sort of belief. I've actually seen myself with a Yanomami shaman where they will, the woman was sick, and the shaman goes up to her and begins to suck on her head. And he sucks and he sucks and he sucks and he sucks and he spits out this bloody fluid. And you think, wow, how do they do that? They don't have dental floss. So when they all they have to do is create a suction in their mouth, and you are able to pull up some blood and you spit it out. But the idea here is that they're sucking out the malignant forces that have gotten her sick. In a woodcut from an alchemical text, the Theatrum Chemicum, a man is depicted in the deathly state of the Negredo. It's basically a heavy depression before the depression lifts. It's called the Negredo. And while out of his mouth there have flown two bird-like figures with human heads, symbolic of the soul or spirit. In addition to the mouth as the departure point of the soul, there are also numerous European paintings illustrating exorcisms, in which the exorcised demon is seen departing by way of the mouth. The fifth basic symbolic meaning of the mouth is that of integral consciousness. In this context, the mouth may represent a vessel containing the universe, or simply be the organ from which divine wisdom comes forth. Here we see the river of life pouring forth from the mouth of God. The seventh chakra in a Tantric Indian painting. You see in this Tantric Indian painting, you see Shiva, who is the dead god, and he's copulating with Chihinamasta. And you can see he's the dead god because he's white. She, however, is pink. That tells you she's alive, even though she's cut her head off. And what the tantrikas, the practitioners of Tantra will do is the male will withhold the ejaculate in order to awaken the spiritual energy, the kundalini, and drive it up through the seven chakras. And what it's doing here is it's coming out the seventh chakra. It's basically, you could call it an image of sublimation. It's transforming the sexual instinct into sublimation, and it comes out of his top knot. And you can see in the close-up there's a little head there, and it's out of that mouth that the river Ganges, the river of life, comes pouring forth. That seventh chakra is called the Sahasrara chakra, which is also known as the mouth of God. In the creation mythology of the Ngaju Dayak of Borneo, a cosmic totality was conceived of as originally lying undivided in the mouth of a great coiled water snake. In an Indian tale, Lord Krishna, as a child, was eating clay when his foster mother heard of his mischievousness and went to scold him. Upon her arrival, he wiped his mouth clean and denied her accusation. He was not eating mud. Not believing him, she opened his mouth, looked inside, and saw it contained the entire universe. Recalling Jimmy's drawings of the closing mouth and our review of the symbolism of the mouth, I find that nothing describes the autistic dilemma quite so poetically as that of a soul that is unable or unwilling to embody. It is in the union of the soul and the body that the psyche gives birth to the hero and the ego with it. And the autistic child, of course, has an absent, weak, or damaged ego. Thus it appears to me that the image of the mouth that Jimmy was preoccupied with, and around which all autistic children have great conflict, may be, at a symbolic level, expressive of the soul's inability to fully embody. We can also wonder if the psychomythic gap, but I'm calling the psychomythic, is in the psychosexual, we're going to project psyche onto the skin. In the psychosocial, we project it into the social surround, and in the psychomythic, it's actually a term Freud used in a letter to Wilhelm Fliess. The psyche is projected onto the walls of the universe, into the spiritual, the philosophical, and political concerns. We can also wonder if this psychomythic gap between the mouth and the soul is equivalent to the psychosexual gap between the mouth and the nipple. I know this kind of formulation threatens to scramble together the body, the psyche, and the soul, yet I ask your indulgence. It is a poetic formulation to be sure, but it might be useful as well. When I say the autistic dilemma deals with that aspect of mouth symbolism pertaining to embodiment, I am talking about the psychomythic task of an incarnating soul. Psychologically speaking, this is about bonding. This is about attachment, taking title to the body, entering the family, and entering the world. The autistic child as a disembodied or poorly embodied soul has a weak relation to the body, to pleasure, to pain, to the family, to language, to society, and the world. The autistic child does not, in a sense, want to enter the world, or can't enter the world, or feels unwelcome in the world. It's very difficult to talk about a child feeling unwelcome or not wanting to enter the world. The nature of subjectivity is so primitive here. It's you enter into a very difficult task of trying to figure out, who's there and what do they want and things like that. So these are simply ways of talking about it. So the main symptomatology is organized around the mouth, around eating, drinking, and speaking. To embody or incarnate is for the soul to enter the mouth and for the child to be swallowed by the world. What I am asserting here is that as the infant is taking the world in through his mouth, he's simultaneously being swallowed and incorporated into the world. We always say, in the oral stage, the child is taking the world into the mouth. Everything goes into the mouth. And what I'm saying is simultaneously, the child is entering the mouth of the world, entering its own body, entering the family, entering the world around. If they don't, they're in that floaty, horrible, autistic world. When I speak of the autistic child as not feeling welcome in the world, I'm not saying the autistic child is not welcomed by the world, but rather that the child does not feel welcomed by the world. That feeling could be derived from an unwelcoming world, but also from a child who is neurologically incapable of bonding, attaching, trusting, and feeling welcome. If a child is rejected by a mother, he will feel unwelcome, but if he's neurologically immune to attachment, he might similarly feel unwelcome. If orality pertains to incorporating and being incorporated by the world, and autism involves traumatized orality, then perhaps we could say, even if only poetically, that the psychomythic task of both the infant and the autistic child is embodiment. Now, it just so happens there's an ancient ritual that poetically describes the process of embodiment, but interestingly enough, it is not a birth ritual. It is a funerary ritual, dating back some 5,800 years to ancient Egypt. It is called, of all things, the ritual of opening the mouth. If it seems paradoxical that the psychological birth and orality would in some way be associated with a funerary ritual, we need only remember Bertrand Lewin's oral triad of wishes: the wish to devour, the wish to be devoured, and the wish to go to sleep or to die. The function of the ritual of opening the mouth was to reunite the spirit and the soul with the body, the corpse, in order to be reborn as a spiritual being, to purify, sanctify, and revivify the deceased, to guard him against death and decay in the hereafter, to transfer to him the strength, powers, and immortality of the gods, and to open his mouth and eyes so that he might partake in the sepulchral offerings of food and drink. It was through this ritual that this spiritual being acquired the ability to speak, eat, breathe, think, see, hear, smell, and walk. His flesh and bones were reunited, his head reattached to his body, his arms, legs, feet, and hands were once again under his control. He obtained twofold strength, all-encompassing knowledge, and was welcomed into the house of God, where he was to dwell throughout eternity in the presence of the gods. The ritual of opening the mouth begins by identifying the deceased with Osiris, a hero in Egyptian mythology. It recalls in drama and incantation the death and rebirth of the great hero. Throughout the ritual, the corpse was purified, sanctified, and revivified with water, libations, incense, and ointments. The mouth and eyes were opened with various instruments, which also transmitted life and power to the spiritual being. Near the end of the ritual, the reborn spiritual being was said to have a mouth like that of a suckling calf on the day it was born. Numerous food offerings were then presented to him, and these always included milk, cheese, and an animal's breast, reflecting the rebirth and reunion with the mother. If the soul was not reunited with its corpse, it remained a disembodied soul, hungry and thirsty, unable to speak or breathe, eating filth and drinking polluted water. He was said to be sad, wandering in the desert, and bringing sickness, disease, and trouble in his path. His flesh and bones were not united. His head was separated from his body, and his body parts were out of voluntary control. He was powerless and isolated from the company of the gods. The similarity between the poetry of the disembodied soul and the torment of the autistic child is striking indeed. Not only can the autistic child be viewed as a disembodied or poorly embodied soul, but he's also known to have profound eating and speech disturbances, frequently seen very sad or depressed, and like the disembodied soul often presents a behavior problem for others. He may have limited control over his body, distorted body perceptions, or a poor body image. He lives in emotional isolation from the people around him, including his mother. In poetic terms, he has not left the celestial realms, entered the mouth of this earthly world, and been psychologically born by way of a close relationship with a mothering figure. As Tustin would poetically put it, he has not come down to earth. Although the myth of death and rebirth has long been known to play a central role in funerary rituals around the world, I have found that the image of the mouth as a passageway for the soul also plays an essential role in many of these rituals. The funerary ritual of the ancient Aztecs, the Chinese, the early Romans, the Spanish, the ancient Greeks, the Laotians, the Turkish, the Pacific Islanders, and some tribes in Africa, North America, and many others include some aspect that specifically involved the mouth. In most cases, a piece of jade, as you can see, there's a little piece of jade in the mouth of this. I think this is a Mayan or Aztec burial here. In most cases, a piece of jade, gold, a pearl, a ruby, some water, a drop of honey, or a coin was placed in the mouth of the corpse. Although each culture attributed a slightly different meaning to this gesture, they all associated it with giving the person strength or assistance in the journey to the world beyond. Several associate the item in the mouth either directly or indirectly with the soul itself. For some, a coin was placed in the mouth to pay for the ride across the river Styx. Others bound the mouth to keep the soul from escaping and causing problems. Examining the imagery associated with the ritual of opening the mouth and comparing it with the imagery associated with the funerary rituals from around the globe, I found there to be three common motifs: reunion of the soul in the body, rebirth, and reunion with the mother. These three motifs remind us of what we might call the healing task of the autistic child, who needs so desperately to embody, bond, attach, be psychologically born, and enter into a warm relationship with a mothering figure. Now, the funerary ritual is analogous to the healing task of the autistic child, as well as to early developmental task of the infant, making the transition from being a neonate to being a bonded and attached infant. This psychomythic task of embodiment is best thought of as a matter of degree rather than a matter of success or failure. The degree to which one embodies is reflected in the degree to which the soul trusts its environment enough to let go, be swallowed, and send forth a rudimentary ego that will enter into relationship with a mother and be nourished. The degree to which one trusts is directly related to the degree to which one feels physically and psychically welcomed into the world. While it has long been noted that the infant comes to understand and incorporate much of the world by experiencing it through the mouth, I suggest that the soul of the infant is simultaneously being incorporated into the mouth of the human or earthly world. That is, being incorporated into the body, the family, and culture. It is not a task without dangers, for it represents engulfment and means becoming vulnerable to the pleasures and pains of human existence. It means leaving the celestial or hallucinated realms, becoming embodied in this earthly world, and being nourished by a mother in a warm maternal attachment. The inability or unwillingness to leave the hallucinated realms and embody represents the mistrust of a soul that perceives the world as a hostile environment in which there is more pain than pleasure, whether there truly is or not. Withholding its trust, the soul cannot embody. Unable or unwilling to embody and enter into the relationship, the autistic child remains separate, aloof, above, and outside the world of warm human relations. This leaves him always desiring to enter the world, yet paradoxically frozen in fear of being swallowed up by it. And there he remains, alone, disconnected, and figuratively poised above that closing mouth and its terrible teeth. You can see I'm moving from Totem and Taboo into phenomenology of an autistic child, into theoretical understanding from psychological perspective, and then this, what I would call poetic description. And you'll see now how I'm going to try to pull it back to Totem and Taboo, if you can imagine such a thing. We return now to the phylogenetic project of psychoanalysis. For Freud, the myth of Oedipus and the totemic feast were not casual literary or religious metaphors of the phallic stage. No, he saw them both as remnants of a time in prehistory when incest and patricide were practiced and then abandoned in the construction of culture and the superego. You see, that's why sometimes you get into all of this myth and ritual and the soul, and it starts sounding just plain goofy. But when you just go back and you remember, Freud was dead serious about this idea that the Oedipus complex is not a casual metaphor. It's not like, oh yeah, I observed this in my patients and I read this play, so oh yeah, maybe they look similar. No. His office was filled with his antiquities, which helped him remember another time when the psychology was lived out. And so if we were to associate autism and early infancy with the myth of death and rebirth, and the ancient funerary ritual, how far back could we trace its origins? Well, the myth of death and rebirth would be difficult to trace beyond the birth of writing at the dawn of history. But the ritual itself has certainly left its traces in prehistory. Some funerary rituals prepare the soul for a journey to the netherworld by offering food and supplies. An offshoot of this tradition is the funerary feast for loved ones who participate in the death and rebirth of the deceased by partaking in the sepulchral offerings. The presentation of flowers symbolize spring, new life, and the cycle of life, of death and rebirth. The funerary boat, crypt, mausoleum, coffin, tomb, and cremation urn are also associated with the womb of Mother Earth. These examples are many, but let me offer an abbreviated tour beyond the veil of prehistoric amnesia. The ancient Egyptian ritual of opening the mouth is 5,800 years old, but archaeologists at a 7,000-year-old Bronze Age burial near Nazareth, Israel, found a corpse that was laid to rest in a fetal position in a large clay pot, perhaps symbolic of the womb. On the island of Cyprus, 8,000 years ago, there lived people who buried their women accompanied with stone bowls and necklaces, and their men and children accompanied with pins and other offerings. All bodies were set in the fetal or contracted position. At Nicomedia, on the eastern coast of the Grecian peninsula, an 8,200-year-old Neolithic settlement included a burial in which a large pebble was placed into the deceased's mouth. The people of the Upper Paleolithic period commonly prepared their dead by dressing them in their best clothes and sprinkling them with red ochre as if to revivify them. The bodies were contracted into the fetal position or stretched out and placed in shallow graves under the living space. Whether it was a cave or an open site, in some locations, stones or heavy bones served as roofs over the deceased, and in most cases, food, jewelry, or stone tools accompanied them in their graves. In the French cave Grotte d'Enfant, 2 people were buried in the fetal position, covered in red ochre, and accompanied by perforated shells and decorative objects. This funerary site is 30,000 years old. The big cave of Shanidar in northern Iraq has a cave in which a Neanderthal was found buried on a bed of woody branches and bright, colorful flowers. The flowers were identified by the microscopic examination of pollen found in the soil below and surrounding the bones. The Shanidar flower burial is 60,000 years old. And finally, there's the cave on Mount Carmel in Israel, where there were found 8 male and 10 female Homo sapiens, intentionally buried in a site littered with 10,000 stone tools. One of the skeletons is that of an adult male who was laid on his back and turned to the right. His legs were flexed tightly, and his chin pressed close to his chest. His left arm stretches out across his body, with his hand clasping the jawbone of a wild boar, perhaps an amulet of an ancestor spirit or totem. This intentional burial and apparent funeral was conducted 90,000 years ago. Though there is no space to properly elaborate all my thinking on this matter, what I am getting at is that the oral dynamics of infancy and the traumatized orality of autism find cultural expression in the myth of death and rebirth, the funerary ritual, and the Upper Paleolithic itself. We could elaborate this point even further with a recognition of the emergence of the modern symbolic function 50,000 years ago, which gave rise to ritual burials, ritual cannibalism, the veneration of amulets, and representational painting and sculpture. It all started then. All of these cultural manifestations are based on the notion of a soul projected out into the world, much as a mother projects a soul into her baby in the daily greeting ritualization. The mother looks at the baby as though someone's in there and helps bring that little someone out. It seems reasonable to assume that if the mother's greeting is not offered, the infant might become autistic. And similarly, if the greeting could not be received for some neurological reason, this too might result in autism. And of course, the funerary ritual is created for the deceased loved one who no longer returns our greeting. Now let's return to the phylogenetic project of psychoanalysis and recall the analogous relations established by Sigmund Freud and John Perry. We touched on this before. We saw this. Now, Freud's reconstruction in Totem and Taboo was partially based on the rather limited data available on ancient prehistoric cultures. Nonetheless, it was compelling. If we put Freud's analogous relations aside for a moment, we get a chance to see my work and Perry's work side by side. So we see infantile autism, the oral stage, myth of death and rebirth, ancient funerary ritual, upper Paleolithic. Then we see brief psychotic disorder, genital stage of adolescence, myth of sacral kingship, ancient New Year's festival, urban revolution. Each schema is held together by analogous imagery. With these 2 points in the schemas of psychological development and cultural evolution established, we are now in a position to wonder what took place in our evolution between the Upper Paleolithic period and the Urban Revolution. And in what way were those cultural changes related to the stages of psychological development between infancy and adolescence, between the oral stage and the later genital stage? This is what I've been working on for the past 40 plus years. Without being able to go into all the details today, this is what I found. And you'll notice the similarity between my reconstruction of the third stage and Freud's reconstruction. That first stage, associated with the oral stage and infantile autism, the Upper Paleolithic, this is at a time when all of these, the most basic of spiritual principles is emerging. The concept of the soul, or whatever people might have called it. This is where the ancestors live in the amulets. The cannibalized people have a soul or an essence or something that can be internalized. The animal is now in the painting on the wall of the cave. There's all these ways in which the Upper Paleolithic is all about this, the soul of the deceased, the cannibalized victim, the totem, the amulet, etc. What's the second stage about? I'm going to associate it with the obsessional neurosis, the anal stage, and the myth of paradise and the fall from grace. Well, guess what happens in the second stage of cultural evolution? That's the Neolithic. This was an extraordinary time in the Paleolithic. The people wandered with the animals. They wandered with the seasons. They wandered going after the hunt as hunter-gatherers. They followed the ripening fruits and vegetables and the herds. But in the Neolithic, they said, stop. We are going to separate ourselves from nature. We're going to build a wall around our village. We're going to make permanent houses with walls around them. We're going to put a wall around our furnace, and we're going to create these cultural wombs, basically. So you get all of this imagery, not only the imagery of containment of the inside and the outside and all of the inherent anality, but you also get all this work with clay being done. Well, what kind of rituals can we see in the clay and ceramic? What kind of rituals can we see? House building rituals. Well, what's the house building ritual about? It's sacrifice. They bury a person under the house over and over and over again. And you find other ways in which the ritual of sacrifice begins to enter in. And you have the ritual of sacrifice, which is what the child has to do. Is I'm going to put the fecal stool here, here now instead of there then, and for that sacrifice, I'm going to get mother's love. Okay? But there's all sorts of sacrifices going on. What would Freud call a sacrifice? The renunciation of instinct. And when you renounce instinct, you enter into culture. Well, what about the third stage, the phallic stage, myth of the hero? To tell you the honest truth, I had the most difficulty being able to elaborate that, except for the fact that this is the time of the menhirs and the cromlechs. These are all of these phallic images. Stonehenge is one of many where people were involved in making all these different phalli and constructing phallic symbols and constructing phallic and tombs. And you have tombs in the shape of the mother's body, and you have all of these imagery of fertility. And I like to think that it may well have been in the High Neolithic that culture discovered the relationship between sex and birth. That's one of the ideas I suggest, that might be where this cultural sexual enlightenment began to dawn. And the fourth stage returns us back to John Perry's work, which is really fascinating reading for those that might be interested. Thank you. This is, as I say, an introduction to a larger piece of work that's been going on for more than 40 years. And you can see how, when I tried to present this material a few years ago here, I think I did it in 3 rather wordy hour-long presentations, which was something of like picking up a jellyfish, a large one. Today I tried to contain it a little bit, but you can see how challenging the material is, and I think this is partly why, after Freud, so much of Totem and Taboo was let go. But anyway, let me stop there. And